Welcome to the InfoSec Insider podcast, brought to you by URM, the UK's leading information and cybersecurity specialists.
Hi, my name's Annie and I'm here today with Wayne Armstrong, who's one of our senior consultants here at URM. Welcome to another episode of InfoSec Insider. So today Wayne and I are going to be talking about the technological controls from Annex A of ISO 27001. So Wayne, just to start off, I've got my first question for you is probably fairly self-explanatory for most people, but would you mind giving us an understanding of what the 34 technological controls in Annex A are designed to do?
Yeah, so to start off with, probably it's worthwhile saying that obviously we're working now with a fairly new version of the standard, which is the 2022 version. And the standard has been restructured, or Annex A has been restructured, and the controls have been grouped differently. So there used to be 14 different groups. There are now only 4. And the idea of this is to give you an idea of defense in depth. So the idea is you can pick different controls to mitigate different risks, and the controls would be of different types. So we've got a number of organizational controls, such as segregation of duties and implementing policies, things like that. We've got people controls, which is, background screening, training, that kind of stuff. We've got physical controls, which is, it does what it says on the tin. So it's about protecting buildings and protecting physical assets, etc. And then, as you mentioned, we've got the 34 technological controls. And obviously the idea of that is that those controls are designed to mitigate any risks associated with technical type threats. So organizations, and let's face it, most organizations are doing this in the modern business world. They're using IT solutions to do whatever it is they're doing. So really, these are about ensuring that we resolve any vulnerabilities associated with IT solutions or mitigate against technical threats, things like viruses and hacking and things like that. So I think that's really what we're trying to do with these technological controls.
As I said, there are 34 controls to choose from this control theme. So how should organizations go about choosing the most appropriate ones?
There's a couple of different answers here. So it depends how organizations are using the standard. The majority of them, if they're actually using 27001 and therefore Annex A, they're going to already have in place the mandatory requirements out of ISO 27001, which includes risk management. And so the first answer is around ensuring that you identify what risks you face, and with regard to risks that are of a technical nature. And as I mentioned, you've got the risk of assets being targeted by viruses and things like that. Then a technical solution would be useful. So you would use your risk assessment to identify what the problem is, and then identify controls in the standard in order to resolve or mitigate that problem. Some organizations might actually only be using 27001 from the point of view of Annex A itself, and just using it as a list of best practice controls that they can put in place. And so if some organizations are using it that way, I would probably suggest that they might be better served by using ISO 27001's sister standard, which is 27002, because that document gives you not only a lot more guidance with regard to each individual control, but they've introduced a new thing in the 2022 version called attributes. And the idea of that is that you can, once you've determined what your problem is that you're trying to resolve, or what objective you're trying to achieve with your controls implementation, you can shortlist different controls based upon their attributes. So, for example, there are attributes associated with the 3 different aspects of information security, so confidentiality, integrity, and availability. There are also attributes associated with detecting issues or preventing issues, etc. So what you could do is shortlist the controls by mixing and matching those attributes. So, for example, if I want to prevent unauthorized access to information, what I would want to do is choose all of the controls that are associated with confidentiality using the attributes, and then I would choose all of the controls from within that subset that have the attribute of prevent, and that will give me a shorter list of controls to choose from in order to address that type of issue. So I think that's where, especially organizations that are starting out afresh with 27001, I would take a close look at 27002 and the use of those attributes to choose those controls.
I've read a few of the controls in Annex A of ISO 27001, and I think this is true across all of the themes. But particularly with technological controls, the requirements are quite high level and don't really give you much in terms of how you actually implement them or what you actually need to do. So how should an organization go about determining how to meet the requirements of the controls in the standard?
Yeah, so this kind of follows on from the previous question, really, and I'm going to invoke in ISO 27002 again, because there's a significant amount of guidance, and it's been updated since obviously the 2013 version. So there's been some significant changes with regard to the guidance. Some controls have been merged and other controls have been updated, etc. So I would recommend that once organizations have chosen which controls are applicable to their particular needs and objectives, then have a read through the guidance and determine which elements of the guidance are desirable. So to be clear, you won't be audited against 27002. 27002 is just a guidelines document. It's Annex A of 27001 that you would be audited against. And so it's not wrong to not implement all of the guidance in 27002. There's going to be guidance in there that just simply doesn't apply to an organization, and so therefore they wouldn't do it. But it will give them much more information around the sorts of things that they should consider for implementation in order to meet the requirements of that particular control in Annex A.
Are there any constraints that might prevent an organization from implementing certain controls? And if there are, what can they do about it?
Yeah, so there are one or two potential barriers that might prevent organizations from implementing certain controls. And I guess the obvious one is going to be associated with cost. No organizations, with the exception of the odd one or two, no organizations have an infinite budget. And so therefore, they're not going to be able to choose sort of the Rolls-Royce situation or the Rolls-Royce type control that sort of does everything, has got all the bells and whistles, etc. And so they may actually be in a position where they identify a particular solution, a particular piece of software or service or whatever it might be that they want to implement in order to meet the requirements of a particular control, but they're prevented from doing so because it's just too expensive. But one of the things that kind of going back to what I mentioned in one of my previous answers is that these controls are not necessarily going to be used in isolation. So what you should be looking at is all of the different controls that meet the attributes that you're trying to achieve, or the objective that you're trying to achieve. So just because you can't implement a particular solution or a particular control doesn't mean you can't mitigate the risk. So you would just look for alternate controls or alternate solutions. And I would say that if cost is one of those things that is preventing you from implementing a particular service or piece of software or whatever, I would recommend shopping around, because there are usually cheaper options that will be, even if only partially effective, at least it's going to sort of add some benefit into the mix along with the other controls to help you mitigate your risks.
So then, looking at the other end of the spectrum, can organizations overdo it in terms of implementing technical controls?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this probably applies to all of the controls, not necessarily just the technical ones. But one of the things that we tend to come across is that, IT teams and, the IT parts of organizations, they tend to like to play with the latest tools and implement the latest gadgets and all of those kinds of things, which is fantastic because they're staying at, the cutting edge of technology. But the problem is you need to balance the effect that you're having by implementing these technical solutions against the need for the business to do what it needs to do in order to achieve its business objectives. So, a basic example of that would be if an organization is worried about confidentiality, etc., then from a technical point of view, you could put lots of solutions in place that prevent unauthorized access to different information assets. So things like encryption and stringent access controls and loads of other things that would help. But the problem is if you overdo it, you potentially raise another issue around other risks that you might actually create by implementing those solutions. So, for example, in the example I've just given, if you put too much control in place from a security point of view for the confidentiality side of things, you might actually make things worse from an availability point of view, because everybody that's trying to gain access to that asset to do their legitimate work may have to jump through too many hoops in order to get that access, and it slows them down. So you have efficiency problems, and also you run the risk of those people that are experiencing those issues trying to find an alternate way in. So they try and find their way around those security solutions that you've built, and the problem is with that kind of access might not be detected. So you need to try and achieve a balance between security versus productivity.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the thing I always hear about with, across the board with all of the different controls is, you don't want to overdo it to the point that people are just taking shortcuts and creating new risks in the process. So do you have any sort of final closing thoughts for me, Wayne, on this one?
Yeah, I guess that, and again, it's not just necessarily the technical solutions, but across the board. I think in terms of choosing which controls to put in place and which risks need to be addressed by those solutions and how to go about choosing appropriate controls, etc., make sure you have a structured process for making those decisions. So it's probably going to be part of your risk management solution, your documented risk management methodology. When it comes to the risk treatment aspect of that methodology, make sure that you've got a good understanding of how you're going to choose which controls are applicable and to what extent they need to be implemented, etc., and what sort of reviews and testing that you should do following the implementation to identify A, whether or not you've resolved the issue or mitigated the risk, but also B, ensuring that, as you've just said, that you've not overdone it and you've not caused other issues by implementing those solutions. But yeah, structured process that's grounded in risk assessment, and just using that process to only implement the controls to the extent that they're necessary.
Thank you very, very much, Wayne, for taking the time to talk to me today. And to any of our listeners that want to learn a bit more about the technological controls, Wayne's written an excellent blog that's on our website, urmconsulting.com, which is called Implementing Technological Controls in ISO 27001. So do go and give that a read, and thank you for listening today. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could spare a moment to leave a rating or review at ratethispodcast.com/InfoSec Insider. To listen to more episodes, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Podbean.
Thank you for listening to URM's InfoSec Insider podcast. For more information, visit our website at urmconsulting.com.